Now, let's talk about Anthony Albanese's he's saying he's open to a Makarrata commission, in other words, a treaty and the whole truth-telling process. We saw him on election night promise to implement the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full, and that does include treaty and truth-telling. But given that the Voice failed, and failed pretty comprehensively, Patrick, you would think he would listen to the will of the Australian people, because 61% of them are against the Voice. I would guess more than 80% would be against any sort of treaty process. So why he's even entertaining it, contemplating it, is really beyond me. Is he determined to be a one-term PM?
It seems like it, doesn't it? I mean, I think I've said to you before, I went up to Cape York about a month before The Voice, spoke to people in remote communities, and they were cynical about The Voice. They said this is, big city nonsense, basically. There is no appetite for treaties at the moment, and I think there's a lot of suspicion. What's a treaty about? Is it about actually, truth-telling, as it's called, or is it about activism and sort of reparations down the track? What does a treaty actually lead to? And people are sick of thinking about it. I think people care a lot more about practical outcomes. There have been no improvements across the board in Indigenous sort of health or employment or education for 20 years. People want to see that get better. They're not that interested in sort of going back.
Well, we keep seeing successive governments listening almost exclusively to the activist class, and I think that's a large part of the problem. The very people whose advice has led us here are the ones who are still setting the agenda. Now, let's talk about South Coast residents in New South Wales staging a rally to oppose the government's offshore wind farm plans. Nationals leader David Littleproud told the crowd a coalition government would dump the Illawarra project and will look for other energy options. He said the coalition isn't against renewables, but renewables should be in an environment they can't destroy. That is a good point. The Daily Telegraph ran a poll on this issue. 89% of their readers are against this project, Patrick, but the government is pressing ahead with so many of these large-scale renewable projects, and they do seem to destroy the natural environment, certainly aesthetically, these solar farms, wind farms, and the concerns of local residents seem to be disregarded very easily.
It sounds like there's been very little consultation in a lot of these cases. And I mean, you've got New South Wales, you've got Southwest Victoria, and you've got CFA units in Victoria today coming out and saying, we're not going to put out fires on renewable projects unless lives are endangered, because we don't want these projects. These are bad for our communities. And it sounds like there's a real disconnect between the ideology of the renewables push and those poor people on the ground who actually have to live with the consequences of transmission lines and those sorts of things. It sounds like it's been badly handled. I think we'll see more and more of these kind of protests as time goes on.
I hope that there is some movement, because these projects are happening, and if you travel in the countryside, and a lot of Australians really never leave the big cities where they live, they would see this and they would see the impact it's having on just beautiful parts of the country being really visually destroyed, and God knows what those solar farms are doing to the actual farmable land. Now, Sky News host and former Chinese prisoner Cheng Lei was body blocked at a China-Australia press event by Chinese officials. Let's have a look.
Here you can see an Australian official asking the Chinese media staffer to move from blocking the journalist. The woman in the brown coat and the man in the blue blazer are both standing between Ms Cheng and the cameras, who are about to film the Premier of China and Anthony Albanese walking in together. You can see Australian officials repeatedly trying to get them to move, and when Ms Cheng switches seats so that she's on the other side, the Chinese officials again try to block her view from the cameras. You can see an Australian staffer in the light coat blocking the two Chinese officials from getting near Ms Cheng. This was all during remarks that were due to be made by the Prime Minister and Chinese Premier. You can see here Ms Cheng is very amused by the whole thing, and the ministers are in the background signing documents.
Now, the Prime Minister said the matter had been formally followed up with the Chinese embassy to express Australia's concern at Lei's treatment, calling it clumsy. I would have used stronger language, Patrick, than clumsy.
I don't think clumsy is the right word. Maybe deliberate or insistent.
Yes.
We're on Australian soil here. How can this not possibly be condemned in the strongest terms from the moment it happened? It was all over the news yesterday. It hijacked the bigger story of constructive relations and everything. The Prime Minister needed to come out and condemn it on the spot. He looked very flat-footed. I think it took him till this morning on radio to actually sort of deal with the question properly. And even there, he used, fairly flimsy language to try and make the point.
Well, they seem to be terrified of offending China. We are scared of any sort of economic coercion, any punishment they're going to mete out. But we can't have that. It's not bad enough that they locked up this poor woman for 3 years in just the most horrific of circumstances. The conditions she endured were stuff of nightmares. And then to do this here, the nerve of it is beyond belief.